Chris is in the annual wage review right now. Yeah. This is why I had to do the delegates right stuff yesterday, because she was prepping. If there's anything interesting happening, because we're going to need to deal with it in a day or two once the decision's out. Yep. Yep. Well, there's no point in this.
Silence in court. All right.
Be seated, thank you.
CICS 1 of 2024, Commission's own motion, 2024 State Wage Order pursuant to Section 50A of the Act.
Take appearances, please. We have very full bar tables this morning. Mr. Entrican?
May it please the Commission, my name's Brendan Entrican and I appear on behalf of the Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Collins, is it? Or is it Mr. Harding?
Mr Harding, so I appear on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry with my colleagues Mr Collins and Dr Wesley
And Dr.
later
Wesley.
today.
All right, thank you. Now for Unions WA,
Chief Commissioner Snedden, Initial K, and I'm appearing today with Graham Hanson, who's a Research and Policy Officer with Unions WA, with Rhys James, who's an Industrial Officer from United Workers Union, with Ryan Sumner, who's an Industrial Advocate from the Australian Rail, Tram and Bus Industry Union, and Joshua Brinkman, who's with the WA Police Union.
thank you very much for that. All right then. Now, in terms of the proceedings for today, as we have generally adopted in prior state wage cases, the Minister will proceed first, then followed by CCI WA, then followed by Unions WA, then followed by... Is WACOS going to appear, Ms Hull? We didn't mean to leave you behind, but we weren't sure. You are going to appear today?
Yes, please.
Very well, thank you. And we understand that the Western Australian today, but I should tell you that they have filed a late reply submission that I think hopefully you should have all received by now, which is probably more best described as a reply to the replies. But is there any objection to that being received by us from anyone? No. All right, thank you. Very well. Now, we understand also, Mr Entrican, that as the usual procedure will follow, that you intend to call Mr Christmas first to assist us with his Treasury presentation. Is that still the case?
Yes, Chief Commissioner.
Very well. We're in your hands if you wish to proceed, unless there's anything else we need to deal with first.
Thank you. If it pleases the Commission Court session, we'll begin with the presentation by our expert witness from the Department of Treasury on the economic outlook for Western Australia. And then this will be followed by an opportunity for questions. And then I'll address the Minister's position as outlined in the submission and submission in reply.
Thank you.
If it pleases the Commission Court session, I'll now call Mr Christmas to the witness box.
Yes, thank you very much.
Please state your full name and address.
David Bryan Christmas, 28 Barrack Street, Perth.
Do you sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence that you shall give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, Mr Christmas, and welcome back, and thank you for making your time available again for us this year.
Thank you, Chief
We
Commissioner.
might just deal with the question of documents at this point that the Minister has provided. Mr Entrican, the witness statement of Mr Christmas.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. Yes.
Do you intend to put that to Mr Christmas, or do we'll just take that as read and we'll admit it? I think might be the most suitable step, unless you want to put it to him.
Yes, I was going to seek leave to tender the PowerPoint presentation, which we have to do. We have plenty of copies for.
Yes, thank you.
the
We'll
other
deal
parties.
with the witness statement first of Mr Christmas.
Certainly.
That will be tendered as Exhibit Minister 1. Secondly, the PowerPoint presentation in relation to the State Wage Case 2024. The Western Australian Economy will be Exhibit Minister 2. There's a third document which is being helpfully annexed to your written submissions, Mr Frenchcombe, which is the mapping of state awards in relation to the C14, C13 issue. We think that will probably go in as well for completeness, and that will be Exhibit Minister 3. All right. Now over to you, Mr Frenchcombe.
Thanks, Chief Commissioner. I'll just hand out some of these PowerPoint presentations for the other parties. That's all right.
When you're ready.
Thank you, Mr Christmas. Could you take us through your presentation?
Thanks. Thank you for the opportunity, Chief Commissioner. Commissioners. If I can begin just by acknowledging the effort my team, the Economic and Revenue Forecasting team, have made in contributing to preparation of forecasting the budget and towards this presentation. They're a fantastic bunch. The presentation today is based on an assessment of the West Australian economy as published in the 24-25 budget released on 9 May 2024. As noted in the budget papers, West Australia's domestic economy grew by 4.7% in 23 and is expected to further accelerate to 5.25% in 23-24. The state's major exporters are operating at capacity, and in fact, so from 24-25, net exports are projected to only be modest in terms of their contributions, which is why GSP is expected to be fairly moderate in the forecast period. One thing that will come through the presentation today is the strength of the labour market. So the domestic economy's strength has driven record employment outcomes, with almost 1.6 million people in April employed and an average unemployment rate of 3.7%. Employment growth has strengthened to 3.4% in annual average terms, building on strong hiring since the onset of the pandemic. It's expected to grow further to 3.75% in 23-24 before easing next year. The strong labour market conditions are flowing through to strong wages growth, so the WPI, Wage Price Index, has grown by more than 4% in year-ended terms in each of the past 5 quarters. And the combination of rising wages and slowing inflation has seen real wage return to positive territory. Consumer price inflation remains elevated. That said, growth in the CPI, excluding electricity, which we'll get to later, fell sharply to 4.1% in year-ended terms in the March quarter, less than half the peak growth of 8.6%. And right at the end, we'll touch on some of the international domestic risks. So just turning to the domestic economy.
I'm sure you might
International.
need a bit of help there, Mr Christmas, if...
Okay, it's working now. Thank you. Okay, global and national context. So the world economy is estimated to have sort of slowed slightly between 22 and 23, and that there's mixed performance across the different economies, and that's partly reflecting the impact of both inflation, higher cost of living, and interest rates that are designed to slow their economies. That said, the IMF is actually forecasting world economic growth to average around 3.2% in each of the next couple of years, which is, it is actually a little bit lower than the historical average from 2000 to 2019, just before COVID, and that just reflects the current policy settings including tighter monetary policy, the tapering of fiscal support coming out of COVID, and this underlying slower productivity growth. In terms of our key partners and our growth, if you use a weighted annual growth, it's not shown up there, but actually this year, 23, we've got 4.1% we're estimating, so that's our top 10 trading partners, with growth slowing to 3.6 and then 3.3 in 2025. The headline inflation has fallen in most advanced economies, although there are divergences starting to appear with some. So you can see from the chart, the United Kingdom is still, and United States are sort of a little bit higher than the euro area. And in fact, the United States, the data sort of showing some stickiness there in that sort of 4%, 3 to 4% range. And also core inflation, which excludes volatile items such as food and energy, is now actually exceeding those headline rates. So that's in part being supported by robust wage growth in the services sector. And goods inflation was one of the reasons that that's been coming down, which is why inflation overall is coming down. The central banks haven't started reducing rates yet, but there's some discussion. So I think at the last meeting of the Bank of England Policy Committee, there was a 7-2 vote to keep rates the same, or two people voted to actually reduce them. So that's just an example of there is probably the next moves will be down, but there's still that debate happening. In terms of our biggest trading partner, China, the growth is moderating, but you can actually see that's been moderating for a while now. Yeah. So it's not something that we need to be concerned about in and of itself. The larger you get in some ways, the harder it is to keep expanding at those. So the early rates in that chart are just unsustainable. That said, there are some areas of weakness. So the Chinese property sectors in particular being quite weak. Now, importantly, that's been offset to some extent by manufacturing and infrastructure, but also exports are starting, particularly the steel, are starting to lift, which is important for us because it's at least the underlying, they're producing that from our iron ore largely. So that's a concern. The sort of property sector is a concern. The Chinese government is even as recently as last week announced some measures to try and support it. RWA commodity prices are very elevated, although they have fallen since the first quarter last year. But you can see from that chart they're still very high. And I think today the iron ore price it's around $120 per tonne, which is above our estimate of the long run average, which is about just over $70 per tonne. And there has been some declines in commodity prices, particularly LNG, nickel and lithium. What we have seen in that chart is there has been a depreciation of the Aussie dollar, which has meant that there is a bit of a difference in the commodity price, with the US index declining more than the Aussie. One of the reasons for that is in US dollar terms, the iron ore price did decline, although only by a small amount. And in Aussie dollar terms, it actually went up. So that's part of the difference there. So we've had a depreciation in the Australian dollar over the last 2 years. That's gone from 72.6 cents to 65.4 US cents. but compared to our most recent financial year, it was a very small. So 65.4 this year over 67 last year. The Australian economy is forecast, so just turning to the national rather than global, activity is forecast to ease, so 3.1% GDP growth going down to 1.75% GDP growth. Again, that is largely because households are pulling back on discretionary consumption and they're spending on new housing as well. So as those things come off. Employment growth is also expected to ease, unemployment rate to rise, we've also got the situation where consumer price index, for the same reasons as we'll go through for WA, are coming off, but reflecting the tight labour market conditions, wages are growing, strengthening to their highest for a while in 23-4, and then nationally they're forecast to go down, and we're following that. We've got a similar trend. So the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, has lifted the cash rate for 435 basis points. 425 basis points from 0.1 to 4.35% between April 22. I think they started raising in May 22, and then November 23 was the last time they raised rates. In its most recent decision earlier this month, the board indicated it expects that it'll take some time yet before inflation is sustainably in the target range, and it will remain vigilant to upside risks. And the board isn't ruling anything in or out when it comes to the interest rate path, and they'll choose the path that they believe best ensures the inflation returns to target in a reasonable time frame. So turning to our economy, and we'll start off with household and business confidence. So if you see on the left side there, the left panel chart, we've had fairly volatile consumer sentiment, but if you look at if you sort of did an average of it all, it is still historically weak. And it's weak both here and nationally. But business confidence in West Australia is positive, and it's roughly around its long-time level, and it's higher than nationally. So that's comforting. In terms of spend, and we just talked about consumer confidence, retail trade volumes in WA have stabilised at a high level. They did decline slightly in the March quarter, but in the year to March quarter compared to the year 24 compared to the year to the March quarter 23, it was basically stable. It went up by 0.1 percent. But that's there was a decline nationally, as you can see. So there was a fall of 1.4% in annual average terms over the year to March 24 nationally. So WA consumption as a whole is doing a little bit better than nationally, and you'll see that also in the next slide. Well, actually, you won't see in the next slide, but what is happening is household consumption increased by 2.7% all up, almost halving in 23, halving from 5%, almost halving from 5% in 2022. And that's in response to those elevated inflation and high interest rates. And when you look at the components, you can actually see the discretionary spending is coming off, and that's what that left-hand side's saying. So consumers are reprioritising spending away from discretionary items to essential items, and growth in discretionary consumption has slowed from 10.4% in calendar 22 to just 3% in 2023. So you can see it's really quite a fast unwind. And if you take away spending on holidays, on travel, that decline is even more marked. And in annual average terms, so both discretionary and non-discretionary consumption grew by 3, but when you exclude transport, it grew by discretionary only grew by 0.4%. So discretionary is really quite weak. And on the other right side, we can still see that even though discretionary growth is coming off, some of the spending is at quite high levels. So we're still spending quite a lot on vehicles. Some of that's because we actually ordered those vehicles in the pandemic, and you don't actually get it, doesn't get recorded.
Takes a long time, that's right.
Yes, certainly does. So one of the reasons we're in a good place relative to our eastern state cousins is that we have a very high household savings rate. So even our household savings rate fell, and it fell, I think, on the, from 21.7% in 2021 to now 15.2% in 22-23. So even though it's fallen, it's way above national savings, net savings, which are running at 4.3% in the year to June 23. So we're good savers in this state, but that has meant we are in a good place to keep spending. Even though I've just said we're in a good place, people are, as I said earlier, are being very careful with that spending. So we're being cautious by saving and also cautious with our spending. So we've got household growth and household consumption. We're projecting it to fall from 3.5% in 22-23 to 2% in 23-24. And we're actually already seeing a decline in per capita spending. So we're in WA, we're seeing per capita spending in calendar 23 went down by 0.4%. And my colleagues calculated 1.3% decline nationally in the calendar year. Again, just sort of emphasising that the East Coast has been hit a bit harder in terms of consumption than we have. So in 23-24, as you can see from that chart, we're actually expecting per capita spending to decline by about 1%. But because we've got such strong population growth, even though each of us is spending less, we're overall spending more because of that strong population growth.
Which is forecast to ease.
It is forecast to ease. Yes, that's correct. Yep. And we'll get to that soon. So, consumption's still growing. We're forecasting it after growing by 2% this financial year, going increasingly to about 3% in the long run. And that'll be supported by things like continued population growth, but as cost of living pressures and inflation comes down, then people have that more capacity to spend. In terms of the housing market, dwelling investment resumed growing in 2023, expanding by 4.5% after declining in financial year 2022-23. So there's a large volume of work outstanding, so more than 23,000 dwellings in December 23. That's the latest data we've got. And so we've got to work through that backlog. There have been some skills issues, and you can see that's why it's taking so long to unwind that backlog. But completions are starting to pick up, you can see that. And we are expecting starts, which haven't picked up to date, but we're expecting them to pick up shortly because all the lead indicators in that right-hand chart show an increase in land sales, an increase in building approvals, and an increase in housing finance commitments for new construction. So overall, we're expecting investment to lift further to 6.7% in 23-24 and 7.5% in 24-25. Initially supported by that backlog and then more and more supported by the new work. Business investment is estimated to grow by 13.25%. So in the coming year, that follows growth of 10.7% in calendar 23, sorry. And the growth of 13.25 is going to be the strongest in over a decade, and it's going to be supported, or it is being supported by Scarborough Pluto project, Crux, Onslow Iron and Western Range projects. We do expect investment, the pace of investment growth to ease from 13.25 to 1.75 and then stay between around 3.75 and 4.25 in the next 2 years. So we are seeing the levels of investment increase, but not quite as rapid a pace in coming years.
Outside of resources, there's been a uptick in investment as well, hasn't there? Non-mining?
Mining still dominates, yeah. Some of that minor investment, what we call minor investment, can be it's not contributing nearly as much as the big projects. They tend to be supported by growth in the big projects, but there's also a little bit more exposure, I suppose, to, because it's your mum and dad stores as well as other things, so they'll make their assessments based on their perception of what's going to happen
Of
in
business conditions.
Yeah, conditions, yeah. In 24-25, while we still think the level's going to be high, you can see that on the chart, it'll still be underpinned by the projects I mentioned, but also some projects which have been delayed in the past due to workforce issues. They'll actually work will start on them. And then in the out years, as Scarborough winds down, you'll get decarbonisation spending by the companies on decarb, which it'll and also just to maintain projects. So that'll support the overall level of investment. In terms of bringing all that together, in terms of the domestic economy, it grew by 4.7%, I think I mentioned earlier, in 2023. And that was the national standout, because our growth was more than double the national of 2.3% in this calendar year. And it reflects that more resilient household sector and supported by that strong population growth. And our very robust labour market conditions. In addition to that, we've got a very robust government spending as well. So we're forecasting 5.25% growth in the state domestic economy this year, slowing to 3.25% next year. And part of that is investment profile just being more level. In terms of our exports, goods exports we're projecting them, and they're the vast bulk of our exports. So we're expecting them to decline actually this year. Part of that is the harvest was nowhere near as good in 23 as it was in 22. I think if you look at the harvest numbers, it's about 40% down for the major grains. So, and we are expecting some weakness in LNG exports just because of they're still going to remain very high, but there's a number of reasons why this year it will just be a little less. And then we expect goods exports to recover in 24-25 with iron ore and lithium production starting to expand. Not by a lot, but they will be expanding. The other reason, services, we're going to see a sort of service exports are growing very strongly this year, and one of the reasons is international students. So that sector is booming. Post-COVID, there's a whole lot of students coming in to the state, and also return of overseas visitors. So that's supporting the external sector this year, and partly offsetting that goods export weakness. But those we're expecting international education overseas visitors spend to actually stabilise in the following years. In terms of overall economic growth, and GSP, growth state product, is that the measure? We are expecting that to moderate from 3.5% in 22-23, which is the latest data we've got, to 1.75%, in reflecting that decline in net exports. And then, as I mentioned earlier, remain modest over the forecast period, largely because key producers are operating at close to, and mostly investment is sustaining rather than expansionary. Sustaining, or in things like decarbonisation, which don't actually add to the amount of production. So in terms of migration, it is growing. It is contributing to our strong population growth. 3% increase in the year to September 23, which is actually the latest data. So the population data is quite lagged. Over that year to September 23, you may have heard the Treasurer, WA Treasurer, mention that's equivalent, partly boosted by record net overseas migration of 94,000, total migration of 94,000 people, most of which would be net overseas migration. So that is a massive boost to our economy, and we didn't quite expect population growth of that strength, and this is one of the reasons why, if you compare what I presented last year for forecasts have been upgraded a lot for 23-24 compared to what we said last year. You can see that net overseas migration has come off a little bit, and we are sort of expecting that almost 50% of those overseas migrants were students, and the federal government is tightening up on the student intake, so we're already sort of picking up that
number will fall off a fair bit in the year ahead.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. And so yes, that's why we're expecting population growth to moderate from 3.2% to 2.8% in 23-24, and then 1.8% in 24-25. Just that normalisation. In terms of the labour market conditions in WA have, as I mentioned, been very strong. So we've had employment growth of 3.4%, and we've actually, in March, we actually had slightly more than 1.6 million people employed. There is monthly volatility, but around 1.6 million employed now. So that's been really strong. We're expecting by the end of the financial year, annual average growth will have increased to 3.75%. However, in line with that slowing in the domestic economy, we're also expecting employment growth to ease to 1.75% next year. And there's a few things that they're just sort of hints that things may be slowing. So you can see that the majority, from the left-hand panel there, the majority of the recovery, in the early period, phase of recovery from pandemic, there was there's been a lot of full-time employment growth, but now we're actually seeing part-time roles have started to pick up over the past year. And what that means is actually hours worked you can see it stabilising in the right-hand chart. So average annual growth in hours worked is 2.9% in April, which is lower than the 3.4% in total employment. And it's down from 5.2% in September 23, which was a recent peak. So you can see that is coming off. Employment growth has been strongest in healthcare, education, retail and professional services. So very strong growth. But again, you can see part-time employment has been quite strong in some of those areas. And then I suppose there have been a number of areas where employment growth has tapered off a bit, sort of moderating that. But yeah, overall still very strong growth. Job vacancies have come off a record in April 23 with monthly job vacancy numbers, but they're still very high compared to pre-pandemic and even compared to the mining boom. So there's still some strength in our vacancy. One of the reasons that even in spite of seeing that chart and it's all looking very good is if you look at the media, there are reports of job losses, including, for example, in the nickel sector. But more broadly, we're just noticing a little bit more across the board. So I think in the last couple of days, Telstra announced a 10% reduction nationally. So that's just an example of where we're seeing, we don't just use data, we're using a combination of information to support our overall forecast view.
I mean, all of the data suggests the market's softening a bit compared to what it was, say, 12 months ago,
Yes.
18 months ago.
Yes, correct. Yeah. And you'll see, we've got a little bit more data which will, in the terms of the unemployment stuff, which will say that as well. So that's why we've got that sort of drop from 3.75% growth down to 1.75. It's still very strong. That builds on some very strong growth. So those are still it's
A very high base.
Yes, that's right. The unemployment rate has averaged 3.7% in the year to April, so that is very low. And if you look at that chart, you can see it's the only other period has been lower for such a sustained period is sort of the around the April the 2005, 2006, 2007 mark. And so it's actually been the lowest in a long. It's the second lowest period of sustained unemployment rate sustained at or below 4% on record. Well, at least since the late 70s, that's what I mean. What you are seeing in the youth unemployment, even in that total unemployment rate, you can see a very slight tick up, and it's more marked in the youth unemployment rate where that is starting to tick up. So the youth unemployment rate has trended higher to 9.4% in annual average terms, up from 8.1% in March 23. And youth unemployment is probably a little bit more cyclically related. So as the economy strengthens and weakens, that's probably more responsive than the general unemployment rate. So again, as that ticks up, it's just telling us, as you mentioned, Chief Commissioner, there's another bit of support for that softening. And the unemployment overall, we're expecting it to be average 3.75% this year, basically in line with where we're at, and then increase over the forecast period as this pace of labour demand doesn't quite keep up with the pace of labour supply, and that being related to civilian population growth as well as we're expecting the part rate. We are expecting that part rate to be relatively high this year, 68.9%. but to ease off over the whole period to the 68.3, which is still fairly high, but just come off a tick because conditions aren't quite as strong. So, and also because of an ageing population, older cohorts don't quite have the same part rate. So going into wages, as the Commission will know, WPI's wage price index is generally viewed as the preferred measure of underlying wage growth because it's not subject to quantity. It measures wage growth for a fixed quantity and quality of labour, and so abstracts from changes such as average hours worked and compositional changes in the labour market. So that's why we prefer that measure. And what's happened is wages growth in WA, well, it's picked up in the last 18 months to 2 years. To be, I think I mentioned it's been above 4% now for 5 quarters, with wage price index growing 4.2% in year-ended terms in March 24, slightly down on growth in the December quarter. And what we are expecting is, before I get to that, the strength has been in accommodation, food, health care and social assistance, where that employment growth's been quite strong. So across a range of industries, it's been relatively strong. That said, we are starting to see a moderation in wage growth, and that you can even see that in that chart of wage price index just ticking down in that last quarter. And then if you look at some other indicators, so growth in advertised salaries is moderated. So in the March quarter, they increased by 0.5 compared to 1% in the December quarter. And that's the SEEK's advertised salaries. And even in the EBA's lodged with the Fair Work Commission, this is fortnightly data. The annual average annualised wage increases sort of fallen from above 4.5% a couple of times, in the second half of last year to being under 4% for most of this last couple of months, although it just ticked over in the last data to just over 4%. That said, it's all suggesting that we might be peaking in terms
Beyond the
of
peak of the market.
Yeah, and that's what we forecast. This year, financial year, 4.25%, and falling to 3.75% next year. And that's just consistent with those that moderation in labour market conditions and those lead indicators. In terms of CPI or Perth's consumer inflation, so we growth in Perth CPI, excluding the electricity index and including it, I've given you both on the left-hand side there. We exclude electricity sub-index simply because that has the government's housing electricity credit does impact on the measured CPI, and it just creates a lot of volatility as it comes in and out of the base. So it's almost trying to give you an underlying, or remove some of the volatility so you have an underlying understanding of what's going on.
I think we've done that over the last couple of years where there have been bill credits.
Yes, correct.
Because of the smoothing effect over that full period of time.
Yes, correct, correct. So we've got CPI's more than half from a peak of 8.6% in December quarter 22 to 4.1% in the March quarter. The pace, a lot of that reduction is because the supply chain pressures have come off, and you can see the close relationship in that right-hand side. However, we're also starting to sort of, so goods inflation's coming down, but we are seeing some price growth in housing and other costs like insurance is still there. So we're not expecting the pace of decline in inflation to be as rapid from now on. In terms of the pace of decline, we're expecting CPI to decline from 4% in 23-24 to 3% in 24-25, and then going into the middle of the RBA's forecast range by 25-26. Just to provide a little bit of perspective, our forecasts are slightly higher than the latest national CPI forecast from the Commonwealth and the Reserve Bank. There's a couple of reasons for that. Partly their forecasts are excluding the electricity subsector, so the household electricity credit isn't dampening our growth rate, whereas in the Commonwealth and RBA they will have that the headline does include the electricity. So that's part of it. And part of it is that things like rent and new dwelling prices are increasing slightly stronger in WA than they are, well, they're increasing at a stronger rate at the moment anyway, in WA than nationally. But nevertheless, we are expecting by next year to hit the top of the RBA forecast sort of target range. And, so that's still a very good improvement. So just to cap off, growth in the domestic economy is expected to moderate next year, partly because business investment consolidation and also because population growth is going to normalise. State exporters are operating at close to capacity, so net export growth will be relatively modest. And after very strong and tight labour market conditions, we are expecting the pace of employment growth to ease and the unemployment rate to gradually rise over the forecast period. Where we do see the risk to the outlook, we've got ongoing conflicts, including Ukraine and the Middle East. So those can impact on commodity prices. Elections over half the world's population during the year, and that can have impacts on trade, depending on, for example, which party ends up in power. You may have very different trade outcomes, and the global climate change policy, the attitude to global climate change policy can be very different, including particularly in the US. Price volatility for West Australia's commodities could disrupt activity. So we've had that in that nickel space. Fortunately, lithium prices, while they came off a lot, have not got to the level that anyone was actually no substantial impact there, and it looks like prices won't, at least in the near term, they're not looking like they're getting there. But it's always a risk. It just highlights the persistent risks. And then we've got obviously if a cost, including mortgages for facing consumers, if the RBA were to raise rates, well, that's a risk for our consumer spending profile. And finally, we've had a lot of delays to residential construction. And as I said, there has been a pickup in completions, but if, for example, for some reason the imbalance stays high between demand and supply in the industry for longer than we expect, that could be inflationary. So again, the Reserve Bank it won't be just our conditions, but national conditions which would dictate their move, but certainly that does represent a risk there too. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Christmas. Are there any questions from the bar table?
Yes, we just have a couple of questions, if that's
Yes,
all right.
Mr. Arden.
Mr. Christmas, does the Treasury factor in productivity in any of its modelling and assessments?
Well, productivity is implicit in what we do, but when we don't forecast explicitly that way. And productivity is inherently very difficult to forecast, can be quite volatile, and need to be very cautious in interpreting any productivity data there is.
But it does inform it, doesn't it?
Well, as I said, it's implicit.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And I just have a couple of questions in relation to some of the information you gave about wages growth and inflation. In the exhibit,
Minister 2?
I think so, in your PowerPoint,
Yes.
you talk about wages growth and its impact on inflation. I just want to confirm as well that you were stating that lower wages growth is going to have a reduction in inflation. Is that correct? Have a contributing factor, I should say, sorry.
Wages growth, to the extent where it's most likely to impact is on the services side of the equation. So what happens with wages and the services will impact.
And just from your presentation as well, you were saying that what's still driving inflation primarily is services growth and services prices, correct?
There are, well, it's the biggest drivers would be because of the size of the contribution of housing and what's happening with rents and dwellings, and because we're expecting those to growth in those prices, they will be contributing to our view of inflation as well.
Okay, no problem. And just a couple more, if that's all right. Thank you. Mr. Christmas, the RBA has said that a key risk for inflation returning to target is productivity. Sorry, that's a bit too loud. Productivity growth remaining weak. Do you agree with the RBA's view on that as a broader economic point?
That's a key risk to inflation, you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, to the extent that real wage growth isn't supported by productivity growth, that can be an issue, yes.
Yeah, and obviously flowing from that, does weak productivity growth limit the rate at which wages can grow without putting pressure on inflation?
It limits the extent to which real wages can grow without putting pressure on inflation.
I think that's all I have because you actually answered one of my other ones already. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Any further questions? Stephen?
Commissioner, we'd just like to thank Mr. Christmas for that. Two brief questions.
Yes, of course. Please go
Asked
ahead.
by Mr. Sumner.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christmas. The economic outlook notes that despite inflation remaining elevated, it's moderated substantially, particularly over the last year. Considering the Fair Work Commission decided last year, the decision last year saw an increase to the national minimum wage of 8.65%. Would you agree that this indicated a direct causal link can't be drawn between the increases to minimum wage or minimum award wages and increases to inflation?
So, yeah, increases in the minimum wage may have, and it all depends on the conditions and impact. But in the current circumstances where people, it's probably going to be limited. So you've got to be very careful drawing those causal linkages. Where they would be is maybe lagged impact as well, but it just depends on the number of people who are covered and by a decision, and also the economic conditions. So it'll be a combination of all those things. So yes, it's not something you can probably not. Well, it's not something like that supply chain chart where you see those direct linkages.
I think you've just answered my second question as well. Thank you, Mr. Christmas.
Thank you, Mr. Sumner. Any further questions from the bar table? Ms. Hull? No. Questions? Thank you very much, Mr. Christmas, once again for helping us and to your team preparing the presentation. It is extremely valuable and we do appreciate your time and efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chief Commissioner. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Intrican, when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. And I'd just like to thank Mr. Christmas once again and his team from the Treasury Department, the Minister and the Department extend their sincere appreciation for their time today. And we note the presentation was very thorough this year and
Indeed.
incorporates a lot of information. So we thank you for that. I'll now move on to the Minister's position. The Minister believes that Western Australian workers should enjoy a modern framework of employment conditions that protects their interests, fairly rewards them for their efforts and provides a level of economic security. At the same time, minimum wage increases need to be affordable for business and take account of their capacity to pay. The Minister's submission in this year's wage case addresses several elements. It deals with the appropriate benchmark for the state minimum wage, the appropriate quantum of any general increase to award wages, and the appropriate form of wording for Principle 7 work value changes. I'll start by addressing the Minister's proposed position regarding the state minimum wage before moving on to other issues. As part of this year's state wage case, the Commission invited submissions on the Fair Work Commission's decision in last year's annual wage review to alter the basis of the setting of the national minimum wage from an alignment with the C14 modern award rate to the C13 modern award rate, and any implications of this for the setting of the state minimum wage, having regard to the history and legislative setting of the state minimum wage. The issue of the appropriate benchmark for the state minimum wage has become a relevant consideration following last year's decision by the Fair Work Commission to realign the national minimum wage from the C14 rate, which is currently in the national system $859.30 per week, to the higher C13 rate, which is currently $882.80 in the national system. This was the first time since 1997 the level of the national minimum wage has been comprehensively reviewed. And the Fair Work Commission determined that the C14 rate was only ever intended to constitute a transitional entry rate for new employees, and as such does not constitute a proper minimum wage safety net for employees in ongoing employment. The Minister concurs with the reasoning of the Fair Work Commission and contends that this principle also holds true in the state industrial relations system. The realignment of the national minimum wage, coupled with the Fair Work Commission's decision to award a 5.75% increase across the board increase to modern award wages, has now created a situation where the national minimum wage is now $19.40 or 2.2% higher than the state minimum wage for a full-time employee working a 38-hour week. The gap's obviously larger for casual employees when the relevant casual loadings in each jurisdiction are factored in. The Minister submits it is undesirable from a fairness and sustainability perspective for the state minimum wage to be set at a rate significantly below the national minimum wage, particularly at a time when cost of living pressures have been impacting many working households in Western Australia. In order to address the growing disparity between the level of the state minimum wage and the national minimum wage, and to safeguard the interests of the lowest paid in the state system, the Minister is supportive of the Commission realigning the state minimum wage from the C14 rate in the Metal Trades General Award to the C13 rate. The Minister's written submission provided broader detail of what such an increase would entail in practice. However, it's worth touching on a few of the key points. Realigning the state minimum wage so it's benchmarked against the C13 rate would involve a one-off increase of $19.90 or 2.3% to the state minimum wage, in addition to any general increase awarded this year in the state wage case. Based on current minimums, the Minister's proposal would see the state minimum wage set at a rate that is virtually identical to the national minimum wage, as the C13 rate in the state system just happens to be 50 cents a week or 1 cent per hour higher than the national C13 rate. They're almost identical at the moment. As per attachment D of the Minister's submission, approximately 37% of state awards contain rates of pay below C13. However, as noted by the Minister, a number of these awards apply to very few, if any, employees. So you've got a lot of awards, things like the Dried Vine Fruits Award 1951 or the Bespoke Bootmakers and Repairers Award 1946. Those types of awards which just don't apply to many, if any, employees in a practical sense. So in a practical sense, there's only a small number of state awards containing rates of pay below C13 that we consider would be likely to be both widely used and where the award wages actually represent the amounts that are paid in practice.
One of the issues that might arise, Mr. Andrican, is because of the unique system in Western Australia with the implication of the state minimum wage into awards because of the minimum conditions regime, is the impact of that proposal on award relativities internally.
Yes.
That strikes me as an issue. For example, where you're effectively abolishing the C14 rate and uplifting perhaps a series of classifications which are below C13 currently, that could have the effect of destroying relativities in a practical sense by equalising rates of pay for different classifications based upon different types of work in the same award. That would be the net effect of it, wouldn't it?
That's correct, yes. So it does remove one layer of relativities at the lowest end. In most cases, the rates that are below C13, or in many cases, it would see the bottom relativity move up one, effectively. It wouldn't distort any relativities above C13, so it would only be that bottom layer in those minority of awards that do have rates below C13. That's correct, yes.
I'm just looking at just take an example in the helpful mapping that's been done by the department, the Dental Technicians and Attendants Receptionists Award, for example, which may not, it's difficult to say whether it's the extent to which this sort of award may be used, because some practitioners may operate in partnership, some may not, some may have corporate structures, some may not. But if you look at the classification structure, which is at page 7 of your mapping,
Yes.
under that award, you've got 5 classifications that would be affected.
Thank you.
Don't know whether you have that to
Yes.
hand. You have, for example, a dental assistant, and then you have a senior dental assistant.
Yes.
If the C14 rate is effectively abolished and the C13 rate applies across the board, all of those relativities disappear, with all of the classifications receiving the C13 rate. And that would seem to be run counter to the principle of work value and payment for work, skills and experience.
Yes. That is true, Senior Commissioner. The one thing I would note with this particular award is the rates of pay in the Dental Technicians and Attendant Receptionists Award way below the rates in the National Modern Awards. For this particular cohort, and I don't know why that's come about, but we were staggered by how far behind the state dental rates of pay were. Like to the extent of around...
They might not have been maintained.
They might not have been maintained, exactly. So,
which is another point.
They were up to $300 per week less than what people in the national system were receiving for the equivalent positions. So we would say that, yes, in the sense that it would create some distortion to those relativities, but they are coming off a very low base.
And I don't know what a simple answer to that is, but I just wanted to raise it with you because, this mapping is very helpful because it does illustrate these sorts of challenges where you are effectively, by the operation of an implied term, providing a floor, which is disregards classification structures and work value. And that's one which the federal system, of course, doesn't have, because the national minimum wage has no connection with the NES, and it's not a statutory implied minimum. That's the
correct.
big difference.
So that's the main difference, and the one which I was going to talk to a little bit further is that distinction